Let's talk to Allie Renison, the director of the global communications company SEC Newgate and a former trade advisor to the UK government. Allie, welcome. Good to see you. Do you think this is all just a negotiating ploy from the Trump administration, and in a month's time we'll be talking about very different figures?
I mean, I think it depends on what the area is. For steel and aluminium, we've seen this happen before. Effectively, this is version 2. So this is not the first merry-go-round on steel and aluminium. I think when you're looking at some of the other sort of extractions that they're of leverage that Trump is trying to get, there's more foreign policy issues on border security, on migration. So I think it depends on the types of tariffs. But we know that he's long had an issue with the amount of steel that he thinks and some manufacturing lobbies think is being dumped on the U.S. market.
So just how significant will the impact of US tariffs be on European businesses, and which sectors, you mentioned steel, which other sectors are likely to be hit the hardest?
Well, I think it depends on the response, effectively, because at the moment we know that steel and aluminium are the kind of the aluminum sectors where the EU produces a lot of these commodities to send to the US and is a competitor, effectively, are a big issue. I think the retaliation that the EU might take is what might affect what sectors are really kind of hit. Obviously, there are manufacturing industries that import from the European Union. They process it. They kind of they use it in their assembly. But if you're looking at what the EU might do to retaliate, then there's a possibility that we'll start seeing retaliatory tariffs on areas like whiskies, on cars, and suddenly the scope of that trade war becomes much bigger.
The UK is outside the EU post-Brexit. Where does this leave the UK? Could these tariffs perhaps have a knock-on effect for the UK, given our close ties with Europe?
Yeah, I mean, the government's had a very heads-down approach right now in terms of how it tries to engage with the US. You know, it's a much smaller share of UK exports in steel and aluminum that are going to the US market. Having said that, the level of our integration with the European supply chains, there's a lot of steel traded between the UK and the EU. We're a big sort of intermediate market for some of that. That potentially has a knock-on effect on raising the costs and prices for businesses and therefore for consumers being passed along those tariff cost hikes.
Realistically, what options does the EU have to respond to these US tariffs?
Well, you can do retaliatory tariffs. There are sort of broader trade defense measures. They've strengthened their arsenal. That basically means that there are other tools in the toolbox to try and basically cut off some of U.S. access to the European market. And some of it may not be immediate, actually. Some of it may be, if you're looking at sort of the divergences in AI, we've heard EU leaders talk about making it harder for Elon Musk's sort of social media platform to operate in those markets. So there's a lot of different ways in which you can respond that aren't just trade-specific.
In a previous life, you were a former trade advisor to the UK government. If you were back in one of your old jobs, what would you be telling these governments? I mean, how should Europe prepare for potential long-term disruptions to transatlantic trade?
Diversify, diversify, diversify. And I do not mean by the state and sort of the government forcing companies to relocate sort of, you know, anything out of the U.S. But I think that now is the time for the trade agreements that were stalled between the EU and the UK and countries like Canada. They need to be revived. They need to be looking at sort of alternative markets to do effective deals with. It's all about the and, not just the or.
Allie, good to talk to you. Allie Renison, the director of the global communications company SEC Newgate, former trade advisor to the UK government.